Hi, my name's Jesse Pirini. I'm a senior lecturer at the Wellington School of Business and Government here at Victoria University of Wellington in New Zealand. And my presentation is as titled, Multimodal Cohesion, Exploring Cohesive Links Across Modes in Higher Level Actions. And I'll explain a bit more about what that title means. More generally, what I'm interested in terms of this idea of belonging and inclusion, is the micro level of interaction. And Goffman had this notion of a with. If you see two people together or three people, sometimes you can tell if they're together, if they're doing something together, and they produce what he called a with. And we can typically see that when we see groups of people doing something together. So what is it that we're picking up on that allows us to see that people are in fact a with? So there's the sense of belonging, but also what about the people who are not part of this with? So there's the sense of exclusion. So how does that happen? And how do we recognize that when we look at people doing things together? And I take a multimodal perspective to explore this question. So my presentation comes in three parts. I start with multimodal theory, so I'll briefly introduce the kind of approach that I take. And then I'm going to explore how we recognize actions that cohere to produce a higher level action. So how do we see actions coming together? Thirdly, I'm going to talk about implications for belonging and inclusion. And again, the key question I'm exploring is this idea of how do we tell when people are together and when they are not? And what are the implications here for belonging and inclusion? So I'll move straight on to multimodal theory because you need to have a sense of that before number two will make sense. So multimodal theory focuses on the mediated action as the site of analysis. Now, in contrast, a lot of discourse analysis and conversation analysis focuses on what people say, the way they say it, who they say it with, and to some extent begins to include where they say these things, the kind of clothes they're wearing, how they present themselves. And multimodal theory takes this to a further level, focusing on speech and language as one of many modes that people use to communicate. So other modes, the ones that I want to focus on here, are typically those kind of body modes. So the use of gaze, the use of facial expression, head movement, body posture, gestures. How do all of these things come together along with speech, spoken language, to produce meaning? And so in order to conduct this kind of analysis, we have to start by focusing on action in a much more general sense. So the notion of mediated action forms the key unit of analysis in multimodal theory. A mediated action is defined as social actors acting with and through mediational means. And mediational means are simply those things that we produce our actions with and through. So I act with and through my body, I act with and through the tools that I use to produce a presentation, a video camera, a computer, and you'll notice any action that people produce is produced with and through material, physical means, but also psychological means. Our psychological means that allow us or that facilitate our production of actions. So the notion of mediated action it's a very big notion, but it's quite a useful theoretical concept to allow us to transverse the multiple modes that people produce action through, and to enable multimodal analysis. Now, Norris 2004 developed this notion of the higher and the lower level action, which makes these very large, potentially very large mediated actions available for analysis. So higher level action consists of chains of lower level actions, and it has a beginning and an end point. So a typical example of a high level action might be a conversation. So you have a conversation with someone, there's a start point to that conversation that's socially determined, and there's an end point to that conversation. And the whole thing is a higher level action. It's produced through chains of gesture, change of speech, chains of gaze shifts, head movements, posture production. So all of these lower level actions come together to produce a higher level action. And now we have the conversation available for analysis in a way that it perhaps wasn't previously. Lower level actions are defined as the smallest pragmatic meaning unit of a mode. So for example, the mode of gesture, the lower level action would be the single gesture unit. In the mode of gaze, a gaze shift from one place to another would be a lower level action. And so you can see that chains of gaze shifts, chains of gestures, chains of utterances all come together to produce these higher level actions. In the example here, I've talked about a conversation, but we could talk about all sorts of different higher level actions. And one final point to make is that people will produce multiple higher level actions at the same time, but at different levels of focus. So you might be deeply focused on this presentation, but you're probably also aware of other things that are going on around you and other actions that you are part of at the same time. Okay, so moving on from this brief theory introduction to explore this idea of how lower level actions cohere, come together to produce a particular higher level action. And I'll explore later on how this relates to the notion of a with and of people doing things together. But if we think of a higher level action, so let's say you're watching this presentation, and at the same time you're producing some other action. You've got someone else in the room with you, and occasionally you turn to them and speak to them, and then you shift your focus back to this presentation. Some of the lower level actions you produce are involved in producing the higher level action of watching the presentation. And some of the lower level actions that you produce are involved in these other actions that you have going on. And so how do lower level actions cohere to produce obviously and clearly one higher level action and not another? So this idea of coherence is, it has come up in, it comes from a linguistic space. I don't want to spend too much time on that though, but I want to speak a little bit more about how it's being used in more multimodal contexts. So Kendon talks about the relationship, Kendon and others, McNeil, and many people working in the gesture space talk about the connection, the cohesive units between gesture and speech. And they explore the ways that gestures might support speech, or speech might support the meaning produced through gesture. And this is this kind of notion of the cohesive tie between multiple modes. What I'm trying to do here in this piece of work, I've been working on with a colleague of mine, Jarrett Geenan, and what we're trying to do is explore the way that multiple modes come together, and how we can see that they are coming together. So I'm going to show you a video example. This data piece is a pitch for a business in a business accelerator program. These three men here are from the business called Litmaps, and you'll notice that there are two high level actions. So in the first one, they're receiving instructions from the researcher, and then they shift their attention into the second high level action, which is pitching the business. And there's a distinct difference between these two actions. We can see a distinct difference in the way that they're produced. And it's this kind of difference that I want to explore when I look at the coherence between lower and higher level, between lower level actions. So let's watch this video. It's about, how long is it? It's not very long, it's about 1 minute long. So just keep an eye out for those two distinct higher level actions.
Where did you get your nickname? It's not a nickname, it's on my list.
Cool, so you've got a minute. See?
Okay.
You can go a little bit over, a little bit under, that's fine.
Okay,
If you've got a lot over,
yep.
So I'll wait a minute.
Okay, cool.
And if you start to get to like a minute 30, I'll probably start with.
Okay, so
and
do I
start the timer whenever you start.
Okay, sounds good. Cool. Hi, we're LitMaps, and we're all about making science accessible to the public. So what we do is we take scientific research, translate it so that it's not full of jargon and words that only specialists can understand, and then we map that all out in a user interface that's intuitive to explore, and so people who want to dive in to find out about a new topic can do that without facing a really high barrier to that learning. Yeah, cool. Sweet.
Okay, so I won't show that again because I think it's probably worth moving on. But I want to look at two ways that lower level actions cohere together. And again, I'm going to get to the implications for belonging and inclusion by exploring this notion of a width of how people do things together. But let's move on. So two ways that these lower level actions cohere to produce high level actions. The first way is rhythm. So modes come to hang together, modes such as head movement and spoken language in the receiving instructions action. And this hanging together produces a type of texture which is sustained throughout the high level action. And it's that texture which in some ways is, how do we define that texture? It comes in part, arguably, from rhythm. And this is a new piece of work that we're exploring. So, I'm interested to see what people think about that idea of the texture of a high level action. What I know is that I can see that shift in from one action to another. And when we begin to explore the rhythm between actions, the way that the modes hang together, it potentially points to something that we are accessing in order to detect and see that shift from one action to another. Another way that modes hang together is through indexicality. So different modes index something, someone, some process, or some space. And by repeatedly indexing that same something, someone, process, or space, a coherence tie is produced between these modes, causing them again to hang together. So we see in the when he's talking about LitMaps, the business, he makes these, he produces these gesture spaces, and these are well studied by, in particular, I think McNeil. These spaces that are produced and then later on referred to. He might then look at them, or as he produces them, he looks at them, and there's a coherence tie produced between the indexing of a space through gesture, giving that space meaning through talk, and also through gaze and head movement and posture. So this indexing produces coherent ties between modes. Now, in this case, I'm only going to focus in more detail on rhythm due to time limitations. So I'll get into that now. We'll look at a couple of ways that these lower level actions hang together in terms of timing. And then I'll move on to talking about some implications at this very micro level of analysis of interaction for belonging and inclusion. So we see at the moment of receiving instructions, we see here at the moment of receiving instructions, the rhythmic coordination of head movement and spoken language as the speaker back channels. So a back channel is something like, okay, yep, cool. Providing a back channel of understanding. In this case, that's how I'm using the term, to the researcher who's giving instructions. And you'll see I've tried to highlight these 4 moments where back channels occur. We've got this head movement aligned with the spoken language. Okay. Similarly in the next one, okay, cool. Yep. Okay. All the other modes remain stable: posture, gaze, and proxemics. And it, when I first looked at this, I thought to myself, well, this doesn't seem that interesting. It makes sense that you might say, and you do your head movement, right? Yes, okay. And this connection between, as I mentioned before, talk and gestures, or head movements in this case, has been studied. But what I want to also highlight is the way that proxemics, posture, and gaze all remain stable. And so it's through the stability of some modes, the coordination of other modes, head movement and spoken language in this case, that produce the particular sense of the action receiving instructions. And that action becomes very obvious, very clear. This person is producing this action, receiving instructions. Now I'll move on to the next action, pitching the business, and we start to see a change in the texture of the actions. So here we have pitching the business, and you'll see here I've highlighted with this red arrow in the number 1 that head movement completely disappears. The speaker keeps his head very stable. He continues to keep his posture very stable, but gestures begin to emerge. He starts to gesture a lot, which he wasn't doing when he was receiving the instructions. So this is the shift in focus, and the texture of the higher level action changes. And what I'm trying to explore here is the ways in which that higher level action texture changes. So moving now to pitching the business 2. So this is the continuation of the pitch of the business. We start to see that gestures and gaze shifts begin to line up. And so there's some kind of rhythmic coordination here between gesture and gaze, the holding still of head movement, with some movement coming up, some movement of posture, and the suggestion is that this produces a particular kind of hanging together. So I'm just going to read this in a little bit more detail here for clarity. So what does this analysis of rhythm show? So the analysis of rhythm here shows a distinct integration across modes, which results in particular lower level actions hanging together in their production. So these lower level actions are seen to be operating together. And this rhythmic integration builds a type of texture which is both sustained throughout the entirety of the high level action. We see that with the receiving instructions, there's a particular type of integration between lower level actions, and it's distinct from other higher level actions that are unfolding before and after. So the pitching of the business is distinct in the way that the lower level actions hang together from the receiving instructions, and there is the production of coherent ties between lower level actions that allows us to see a particular action as a unique action that hangs together, rather than as disparate, disconnected movements of the body, perhaps. So this is not to suggest that the lower level actions are always clearly aligned, that there's this very clear temporal alignment. But through a delicate analysis of temporal relationships between lower level actions, we have begun to see a kind of temporal signature of some sort from one action to another. There's a little bit more to be said here, but I don't want to get into too much more detail. It's quite difficult to get this all across in the presentation time we have available. So I want to move on now to implications for belonging and inclusion. And this is the only slide I have here. I felt like this would be better produced as a kind of discussion. So I haven't gone into a lot of detail of how you see the 3 men who make up lit maps. They produce the presentation together. Even though only one of them speaks, we see that all 3 of them are producing the presentation. There is coherence across the 3 of them. They are clearly all producing that high level action together. And we see that in their posture, we see that in their gaze towards the the kind of audience as the camera. And we see it in their lack of gestures for the two who aren't speaking, and their lack of talk. They don't interrupt this person in the middle. And it seems very obvious. But if we thought of, I went to a presentation and the woman standing up had her son with her, and he was not producing the presentation with her. He spent his whole time trying to get the attention of the audience. He spent his time getting the attention of his mum. He was not producing the presentation in the same way that these other two business co-owners are producing this action together. So we can begin to see belonging at a very micro level. And I really just have a question here. In what ways can we see that people learn to produce actions together? And how do we, as observers of social interaction, pick up, detect, and understand and see moments of belonging and inclusion? I have in my mind, a kind of workplace kitchen where there are groups who are together. There are people who are not included in those groups, whether by choice or not by choice. And that leads us to the question of agency in terms of belonging and inclusion. How do you learn to become included? How do you include yourself on purpose, agentively, in situations where maybe you aren't automatically included? And what are the implications for the different ways that people choose to do this, and the clashes that might arise when people have different practices for producing actions together? And I'm hoping that this kind of multimodal analysis provides us ways to get deeply into the micro level production of these practices of inclusion and belonging.